The smoke detector's shrill scream cut through the house at exactly 3:47 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day, and Sarah knew without looking that her carefully planned dinner had gone catastrophically wrong. She bolted from the living room where she'd been frantically setting the table, her heart hammering as acrid smoke billowed from the kitchen doorway. Through the haze, she could see flames licking up from the oven, orange tongues dancing against the blackened metal. Her hands shook as she grabbed the fire extinguisher from under the sink, her mind racing through the instructions she'd read a dozen times but never thought she'd need. White foam erupted across the oven, across the stovetop, across everything. When the flames finally died and the smoke began to clear, Sarah stood in the wreckage of her kitchen, staring at what had once been a beautiful 20-pound turkey, now resembling something excavated from an archaeological dig of a civilization that had perished in volcanic ash. This was supposed to be perfect. This was supposed to prove something. Sarah had moved to Montana 6 months ago, fleeing a corporate job in Seattle that had slowly drained every ounce of joy from her life. She'd bought a small house on the outskirts of a town so small it barely qualified for the term, population 800 and dropping. Her nearest neighbor was Jack Morrison, whose ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of rolling grassland that turned golden in the late afternoon sun. She'd seen him from a distance, a tall figure in worn jeans and a cowboy hat, but they'd never spoken beyond a wave across the property line. Until 3 days ago, when she'd worked up the courage to knock on his door and invite him to Thanksgiving dinner. "I don't really know anyone here yet," she'd said, clutching a basket of apology muffins she'd baked that morning. "And I thought, well, I'm cooking a whole turkey just for myself, which seems wasteful, and I don't know if you have plans, but if you don't, you'd be welcome to join me." Jack had studied her for a long moment with those weathered gray eyes, and she'd been certain he was going to politely decline. Then his face had cracked into a smile that transformed his entire appearance. "Haven't had a proper Thanksgiving in about 5 years," he'd said. "I'd be honored." Now, standing in her smoke-filled kitchen with tears streaming down her face from the fumes and from sheer mortification, Sarah wondered if she could pretend she'd never moved here at all. She could pack her car tonight, drive back to Seattle, and forget this entire humiliating chapter of her life. The doorbell rang. She glanced at the clock. 4 o'clock. Right on time. Sarah opened the door looking like she'd survived a small war. Her hair had escaped its careful updo, and now hung in wild strands around her face. Soot smudged her cheek. Her nice dress had white fire extinguisher residue down the front. Behind her, the living room was still hazy with smoke, and the smell of carbonized turkey permeated everything. Jack stood on her porch holding a bottle of wine and a concerned expression. He took in the scene without saying anything, and Sarah watched his face, waiting for the polite excuse, the quick exit. "I burned the turkey," she said flatly. "Actually, I set the turkey on fire. And then I sprayed fire extinguisher chemicals all over everything. There is no Thanksgiving dinner. I'm sorry you came all this way." "All the way?" Jack's mouth quirked. "It's a quarter mile. Still. I'm sorry. I wanted this to be nice, and I've ruined everything." To her horror, her voice cracked on the last word. She pressed her fingers against her eyes, willing herself not to cry in front of this man she barely knew. "Hey now," Jack said gently. "Mind if I come in?" She stepped aside wordlessly, and he moved past her into the smoky living room. He set down the wine bottle and turned to face her with his hands on his hips, surveying the scene like a general assessing a battlefield. Then he started to laugh. Not a cruel laugh, but warm and genuine, the kind that invited you to join in rather than shrink away. "I'm sorry," he said when he caught his breath. "I'm not laughing at you." "Well, I am a little. But Sarah, you should see your face right now. Like the world ended because a bird got cremated. I invited you over for Thanksgiving dinner, and there's no dinner." "There's no turkey," he corrected. "What else were you planning?" Sarah gestured helplessly toward the kitchen. "Mashed potatoes that are probably cold by now. Green bean casserole that's probably full of fire extinguisher powder. Cranberry sauce from a can. Rolls that I didn't even get to put in the oven because the oven became a furnace. Apple pie that's been sitting out. So we've got most of the meal, just no centerpiece. And honestly, I never cared much for turkey anyway. It's always dry, and people only pretend to like it because it's traditional. Sarah laughed despite herself, a slightly hysterical sound. Are you trying to make me feel better? Is it working? Maybe a little. Jack rolled up his sleeves. Come on. Let's see what we can salvage. And then I'm going to tell you a story about the worst Thanksgiving I ever had, which will make this look like a minor inconvenience. They spent the next hour cleaning up the kitchen and assessing the damage. The mashed potatoes were cold but otherwise fine. The green bean casserole had been far enough from the oven to escape contamination. The rolls went into the newly cleaned oven, and Jack unearthed some canned ham from her pantry that she'd bought on a whim and forgotten about. It's not exactly traditional, she said, watching him slice the ham onto a serving platter. Traditional's overrated, Jack replied. You know what traditional Thanksgiving was for me the last 5 years? A frozen dinner in front of the TV, wondering why I bothered turning on the oven for one person. As they worked, Jack told her about the Thanksgiving 7 years ago, when a winter storm had knocked out power to the ranch for 3 days, starting Thanksgiving morning. His wife had been alive then, and she'd been furious at first, all her careful preparations ruined. But they'd ended up cooking steaks on the wood stove, eating by candlelight, and he said it was one of the best memories he had of her before the cancer diagnosis came 6 months later. She died 3 years ago, Jack said quietly, arranging rolls in a basket. And Thanksgivings have been hard since then. So when you showed up at my door with those muffins, which were excellent by the way, and invited me over, it felt like maybe it was time to try again. Sarah's throat tightened. I had no idea. I'm so sorry. Don't be. I'm glad you asked. Even with the pyrotechnics. They carried the food to the dining room, where Sarah had set the table with her grandmother's china and candles she'd bought specially for the occasion. It wasn't the feast she'd imagined, but as they sat down across from each other, it felt more real than any perfect spread from a magazine could have been. Jack raised his wine glass. To new neighbors and new traditions. Sarah clinked her glass against his. And to back up ham. The food was simple, but it was good. More importantly, the conversation flowed in a way Sarah hadn't experienced since moving to Montana. She told Jack about her burnout in Seattle, about waking up one morning and realizing she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt genuinely happy. She told him about seeing the listing for the little house online, about making the crazy decision to quit her job and move to a place where she didn't know a single soul. That takes courage, Jack said. Real courage. Most people stay in situations that make them miserable because it's familiar. Or maybe it's just running away. Maybe running away and moving towards something better are the same thing, just depends on how you look at it. Jack told her about the ranch, about how it had been in his family for 3 generations. He talked about the rhythm of the seasons, about calving in the spring and moving cattle to high pasture in the summer. He talked about the loneliness of it too, the way grief and isolation had become tangled together until he couldn't separate them anymore. I stopped seeing people, he admitted. Stopped going to town much except for supplies. Told myself I was just busy with the ranch, but really I was hiding. Martha used to tell me I'd turn into a hermit if she wasn't around to drag me to social things. He smiled sadly. She was right. They talked until the candles burned low, and the apple pie was gone. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this comfortable with another person, this able to be honest about her fears and failures without trying to maintain some perfect facade. As Jack helped her clear the dishes, he said, You know, I meant what I said earlier. This really is the best Thanksgiving meal I've ever had. Sarah laughed. Jack, I set the main course on fire. Exactly. It was real. Nothing went according to plan, and instead of falling apart completely, you figured it out. We figured it out. That's more valuable than a perfect turkey could ever be. He paused, rinsing a plate under the faucet. The best moments in life aren't the ones where everything goes perfectly. They're the ones where things go wrong and you discover you're strong enough to handle it. Or you discover you don't have to handle it alone. Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes again, but this time they weren't from smoke or embarrassment. I thought I'd ruined everything. I thought you'd leave and I'd be the crazy lady who invited her neighbor over and nearly burned her house down. Are you kidding? This is the best story I've heard in years. Wait until the folks at the feed store hear about this. Please tell me you're joking. I'm absolutely going to tell everyone, Jack said with a grin. But I'll make sure they know you handled it like a champion. And that your mashed potatoes were incredible. They were the best mashed potatoes she'd ever made, actually. She'd followed her grandmother's recipe exactly, adding cream cheese and roasted garlic, whipping them until they were clouds of butter and comfort. Small victories. As Jack prepared to leave, pulling on his coat at the door, he hesitated. I know you're new to the area and probably still figuring everything out. But if you ever need anything, I'm just across the way. And I mean that. Anything from borrowing a cup of sugar to help with a project to someone to talk to when it gets too quiet. The winters here can be long if you're by yourself. Thank you, Sarah said. Really. This turned out to be a much better evening than I could have hoped for, despite my best efforts to sabotage it. Maybe because of your efforts to sabotage it, Jack corrected with a wink. Same time next year? You bring the fire extinguisher, I'll bring the backup ham? Sarah laughed, and it felt good, felt like something opening up inside her chest that had been locked for too long. Deal. Though next year I'm setting a timer. Where's the adventure in that? After Jack left, Sarah stood in her kitchen looking at the blackened oven and the remnants of dinner scattered across the counter. The whole day had been a disaster by any conventional measure. But standing there in the quiet house, she felt lighter than she had in months. Maybe years. She'd been so focused on making everything perfect, on proving to herself and to Jack and maybe to the universe that she'd made the right choice in moving here, that she was capable and put together, and worthy of belonging. But the evening hadn't been perfect. It had been messy and chaotic and real, and somehow that had been exactly what both of them needed. The burned turkey sat in the sink, still steaming slightly, looking like a prehistoric fossil. Sarah pulled out her phone and took a picture of it. She'd remember this Thanksgiving, she thought. Not as the disaster it was supposed to be, but as the beginning of something. The night she stopped trying to be perfect, and started being herself. The night she discovered that the best connections often come from shared imperfection rather than polished presentation. Outside, across the darkened fields, she could see a single light burning in Jack's ranch house. She thought about him sitting alone in his living room, maybe thinking about his late wife. Maybe thinking about the unexpected gift of companionship on a day that had been hard for too long. They were both healing, both learning to let people in again after periods of isolation, both discovering that life wasn't about executing perfect plans but about showing up honestly, and seeing what happened. Sarah turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs, already mentally composing the email she'd send to her sister in California, the one that would start with, "You won't believe what I did today," and end with, "I think I'm going to be okay here." Because she would be. The burned turkey had taught her that.